The wind, a biting wolf, howled its song through the narrow streets of Harmony Creek. It was 1878, and the chill of winter had settled deep into the bones of Montana. But a colder, more bitter chill had gripped the hearts of the townsfolk. Alara, a widow for 2 lonely years, felt the weight of their fear press down on her. Her simple life, spent mending clothes and tending a small garden, had become a canvas for their darkest imaginings. It began subtly, with whispers in the mercantile, a child's cough, a cow's dry milk, a patch of frost that lingered too long on the window pane. Each became a tiny seed of suspicion planted in fertile, fearful minds. Alara's quiet ways, her pale skin, and the way her eyes seemed to hold ancient secrets made her an easy target. She never laughed loudly, never gossiped, and always seemed to know when a storm was brewing, simply by the ache in her knees. To them, these were not simple traits, they were signs. Signs of something dark, something unnatural. One blustery morning, the whispers turned to shouts. Old Man Hemlock, his face red with fury and fear, burst in her tiny cabin, accusing her of putting a hex on his prize horse, which had suddenly fallen ill. His wild accusations, fueled by rum and the town's growing unease, quickly gathered crowd. Others, eager to find a reason for their own misfortunes, joined in. Mrs. Gable, whose pies always seemed to burn when Alara walked past her window, swore she'd seen Alara muttering to herself under the full moon. Young Tommy, who'd lost his pet rabbit, tearfully pointed his finger, claiming Alara had looked at his rabbit funny just days before. Fear is a powerful potion, and in Harmony Creek, it brewed strong and bitter. Logic and reason were swept away by the rising tide of panic. The townsfolk, usually hard-working and pragmatic, transformed into a mob, their faces twisted by a terror Alara couldn't understand. She tried to speak, to explain, to plead her innocence, but her words were swallowed by their angry cries. They saw not a grieving woman, but a witch, a bringer of ill fortune, a danger to their very souls. Their fear had painted her into a monster, and there was no brush in her hand to paint herself back to a woman. The air thrummed with their accusations, each word a stone thrown at her fragile peace. She watched their eyes, once familiar, now filled with a cold, unforgiving dread, and she knew her world was about to shatter. The mob's roar was a physical force, pushing Alara backward. Hands, rough and unforgiving, grabbed her arms, dragging her from her cabin and into the icy street. Her pleas were lost in the shouts of "witch" and "begone." She stumbled, her knees scraping against the frozen ground, but they pulled her onward, past the staring faces in doorways, past the general store where she used to buy flour, past the church whose bell had always offered comfort. Now, only condemnation rang in the air. They stopped at the edge of town, near the gnarled oak tree that marked the path to the wilderness. A small, sputtering fire had been built, its flames dancing hungrily in the biting wind. In the heart of the flames, a heavy iron rod glowed an ominous red. Alara's breath caught in her throat. She knew what that meant. Humiliation, sharp and searing, washed over her, even greater than the fear. Sheriff Brody, a man she had once considered fair, stepped forward, his face grim but unyielding. He held the branding iron with a thick cloth, its tip radiating heat and menace. Alara squeezed her eyes shut, but the horror was too vivid to be unseen. A strong hand seized her left wrist, holding it steady. She felt a searing pain, a hiss, and the smell of burning flesh filled the cold air. A cry tore from her throat, a sound of pure agony and despair. When the iron was finally lifted, a dark, ugly mark marred her skin, a permanent scar of their judgment. "This mark," Sheriff Brody's voice boomed, "is to show all who see it that you are cast out. You're no longer welcome in Harmony Creek. Go and never return." They shoved her then hard. She stumbled, falling to her hands and knees in the fresh, deep snow. The cold bit at her, but the burning on her hand was a far worse torment. She looked back, her eyes blurring with tears, at the faces of the townsfolk. Not one offered a glance of pity, not one held out a hand of help. Only hardened stares and expressions of relief met her gaze. They truly believed they had rid themselves of evil. The wind picked up, swirling the snow around her, covering the fresh tracks of the mob who now retreated back to their warm homes. Alara pushed herself up, her body trembling from the cold, the pain, and the crushing weight of injustice. Her branded hand throbbed, a constant reminder of their cruelty. She was alone, utterly alone, in the vast, unforgiving Montana wilderness. The snow stretched out before her, an endless white blanket, silent and indifferent. Each step was an effort, her legs heavy, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The cold seeped into her boots, numbing her toes, then her feet. The darkness of night began to creep over the mountains, making the world even more desolate. She walked, or rather stumbled, for what felt like hours, driven only by a flicker of will, a desperate refusal to simply lie down and die. But the strength was draining from her, drop by painful drop, into the swirling snow. The moon, a sliver of ice in the dark sky, offered little light as Alara stumbled onward. Her branded hand pulsed with a raw, insistent pain, a rhythm of suffering that echoed the throbbing in her temples. The cold had moved beyond a bite. It was a heavy cloak, wrapping itself around her, dulling her senses, making her movements slow and clumsy. Her lungs burned with each icy breath, and a deep shiver shook her entire frame, a shiver that no amount of effort could stop. She felt the strength draining from her legs, like sand slipping through an hourglass. Each step became a monumental task, her feet dragging through the deepening snow. The trees, once sturdy guardians, now loomed like dark, twisted spirits, their branches skeletal against the night sky. The world narrowed to the crunch of snow beneath her failing boots and the dizzying beat of her own weakening heart. Her vision blurred, the white landscape melting into a hazy gray. A sudden gust of wind, sharp as a knife, pushed her sideways. She tried to regain her balance, but her legs refused to obey. Her feet tangled, and she tumbled forward, landing with a soft thud in a drift of powdery snow. For a moment, she lay there, too exhausted to move, too defeated to care. The snow felt strangely soft, almost comforting, a cold blanket inviting her to sleep. A drowsy warmth began to creep over her, a dangerous sweetness that whispered promises of peace. Her thoughts, once racing with fear and anger, slowed to a gentle drift. The pain in her hand seemed to lessen, replaced by a dull ache that she could almost ignore. She closed her eyes, and images flickered behind them. Her mother's smile, the scent of fresh bread from her own oven, the green of her small garden in summer. These memories, once precious, now felt distant, like dreams from another life. She tried to open her eyes, to fight the creeping darkness, but her eyelids felt impossibly heavy. Her fingers, stiff with cold, twitched once, then fell still. Her breathing grew shallow, almost imperceptible against the soft hiss of the falling snow. The bitter cold that at first tormented her now seemed to embrace her, lulling her deeper into its silent, frozen grasp. She was close, so very close, to simply letting go, to becoming one with the vast, indifferent wilderness. The last sliver of warmth in her body began to fade, like a dying ember. Alara, the accused witch, lay still in the snow, a fragile form barely distinguishable from the drifts around her, her breath a ghost in the icy air. She was on the very edge of forever. Just as Alara's consciousness began to unravel into the endless white, a flicker of light pierced the encroaching darkness. It was faint like a distant star, but it was there. A crunching sound, heavy and rhythmic, grew closer. She heard the soft whicker of a horse, then a man's low voice, speaking to the animal. Her frozen mind barely registered these sounds, mistaking them for the illusions of a fading dream. Then, a shadow fell over her. A large, warm presence knelt beside her. A hand, gloved and strong, gently touched her face. It was rough, but surprisingly tender. Alara tried to stir, to push away the hand, but her body felt like a block of ice. She heard a gasp, then the man's voice again, closer this time, filled with a worried tone. Good heavens! What happened here? She felt herself being carefully lifted. The movement brought a sharp jolt of pain through her branded hand, and a soft moan escaped her lips. The man adjusted his hold, cradling her close, and she felt a surprising warmth radiating from him, a stark contrast to the deathly cold that had claimed her. She was light, frail as a fallen bird in his arms. His name was Thomas. He was a trapper, returning late from his rounds, his sled laden with furs. He hadn't expected to find anything but snow and silence on this lonely trail. But there she was, a woman, barely alive, half buried in a drift, her clothes frozen stiff, and a terrible mark upon her hand. His heart went out to her, not with fear or judgment, but with a simple human concern. Thomas carried Alara to his waiting sled, carefully tucking her amongst his softest furs. He urged his horse on, picking up the pace, his brow furrowed with worry. The journey felt long, but soon a faint glow appeared in the distance, his cabin. A small, sturdy structure nestled among the pines, its chimney sending a plume of smoke into the frigid air, promising warmth and shelter. He dismounted swiftly, his movements practiced and efficient. Gently, he lifted Alara from the sled, carrying her through the snow-covered yard and across the threshold of his cabin. The sudden rush of heat from the roaring fireplace was a shock to Alara's numb body, making her shiver uncontrollably even as she was brought closer to the flames. Thomas laid her carefully on a rough but clean cot near the hearth. The firelight danced across her pale, frozen face, revealing the faint, ugly brand on her hand. He saw it, but his gaze held no malice, only a deep, quiet concern. He quickly set about stirring the embers, adding more wood, and heating water, his movements purposeful and kind. He was a silent guardian, a beacon of unexpected hope in her darkest hour. Slowly, painfully, Alara began to awaken. Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing a blurry world of flickering firelight and dark shadows. A strange, unfamiliar scent filled the air, a mix of pine smoke, simmering herbs, and something warm and savory. Her body ached in places she hadn't known existed, a deep, persistent throb. But the biting cold was gone, replaced by a gentle warmth that seeped into her very bones. She became aware of soft hands moving over her, carefully removing her frozen, stiff clothing. A quiet voice murmured near her ear, too soft to make out words, but the tone was calm, soothing. It was Thomas. She remembered glimpses of him, a strong arm, a worried glance. Now, as her senses slowly returned, a wave of dread washed over her. He would see it, the mark. With immense effort, Alara managed to open her eyes more fully. Thomas was kneeling beside her, his face serious and kind as he unwrapped the crude bandages from her hand. Her breath hitched. This was it, the moment he would see the ugly, burned symbol of her shame. He would recoil, his face twisting in disgust, just like all the others. He would cast her out, just like Harmony Creek had. The thought brought fresh tears to her eyes, though she was too weak to cry them. Thomas gently peeled away the last layer of cloth. The brand was stark against her pale, swollen skin, a raw, angry wound. He looked at it, his eyes serious. Alara held her breath, bracing herself for the inevitable rejection. She waited for his expression to change, for his lips to curl, for him to pull back in fear or revulsion. She expected a sharp word, a command to leave, a shudder of horror. But his face remained calm. His eyes, a warm shade of brown, met hers, holding no judgment, no fear, only a quiet, deep understanding. He dipped a clean cloth into a bowl of warm, steaming water, then, with incredible gentleness, began to clean the wound. His touch was feather-light, careful not to cause her more pain. He murmured something, almost to himself, about infection and needing to be vigilant. As he worked, his presence filled the small cabin with an unexpected comfort. He applied a thick, herbal salve to the burn, his movements slow and deliberate. Alara watched him, bewildered. Why wasn't he recoiling? Why wasn't he shouting? Had he not understood what the mark meant? She tried to speak, to warn him, to explain, but her throat felt rough and dry. Her voice was a mere whisper. The mark, they branded me a witch. Her words were barely audible, full of shame and exhaustion. Thomas paused, his gaze still steady. He looked from her eyes to the brand, then back to her face. He did not flinch. He did not frown. His voice was soft, but firm, carrying a quiet strength that settled over her like a warm blanket. I see it, Alara, he said, his voice calm and deep. And I do not care what townsfolk say. Alara stared at Thomas, her mind struggling to make sense of his words. You don't care? She whispered, her voice still rough and weak. It was a concept so foreign, so utterly unexpected after the hatred she had faced. His eyes, kind and steady, held hers, and in them, she saw a truth she hadn't encountered in years. No, Thomas replied, his tone gentle but firm. I care that you were left to freeze. I care that you were hurt. What those foolish people in town believe. That's their burden, not yours. He finished bandaging her hand, wrapping it carefully with clean linen, his touch still surprisingly light. He then poured a cup of warm, weak broth from a kettle simmering on the hearth and held it to her lips. Drink this. It will help. Alara sipped the broth, its warmth spreading through her, chasing away some of the lingering chill. She watched him, still wary, but a tiny spark of hope, fragile as a newborn bird, began to stir within her. He moved around the cabin, tidying up, adding more wood to the fire, his movements calm and purposeful. The cabin itself was small, made of rough-hewn logs, but it was surprisingly neat and filled with a quiet, lived-in warmth. There were shelves lined with jars of herbs and dried food, animal pelts draped over benches, and a well-worn Bible on a small table. You are safe here, Alara, Thomas said, as if reading her unspoken questions. He pulled up a wooden stool and sat across from her, his gaze reassuring. My name is Thomas. I live alone, mostly. My wife passed 2 winters ago, and my children, well, they're grown now mostly, they visit when they can. He paused, looking at the fire. This place is far from Harmony Creek. No one will bother you here. Alara felt a strange tightness in her chest. A safe place. The words sounded like a forgotten melody. For so long, she had known only suspicion, hostility, and finally, violent rejection. To be offered refuge, freely and without judgment, was almost too much to comprehend. Her eyes, still clouded with pain and exhaustion, searched his face. He wasn't a young man, perhaps in his late 30s, with lines etched around his eyes from sun and worry, but his face held a goodness, an honest strength that was unmistakable. Why? She managed to ask, the single word carrying a lifetime of hurt. Why would you help me? Thomas looked at her, his brow furrowed slightly. Because it's right, he said simply. Because no human being, no matter what others say, should be left to die in the snow. And because I've seen enough hardship in my life to know that sometimes what people believe isn't always what's true. He rose and fetched a thick, wool blanket, carefully draping it over her. Rest now, Alara. There will be time for questions later. For now, just be warm and be safe. The weight of the blanket, the warmth of the fire, and the quiet assurance in his voice finally allowed Alara to relax, just a little. She had been running, fighting for so long. Now, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt the dangerous luxury of letting go, of trusting, even a little, in the unexpected kindness of a stranger. This cabin, so simple and far from the world, became her unexpected sanctuary. Days bled into weeks, and with each passing sunrise, Alara felt a little more of herself return. The deep aches from the cold slowly faded, replaced by the gentle hum of returning strength. Thomas was a patient and quiet caregiver. He changed the bandages on her hand daily, applying fresh salve, never flinching from the sight of the brand. Slowly, the angry red began to soften, forming a raised, permanent scar, but one that no longer burned with pain. The physical wounds were one thing, but the wounds in her heart were another. Thomas's cabin, however, became a balm for her soul. She spent her first days mostly sleeping, wrapped in thick blankets, the constant warmth of the fire, a comforting presence. When she was awake, Thomas would often be nearby, mending traps, sharpening knives, or reading from his worn Bible. He didn't demand conversation, letting her heal in silence, but his presence was a steady anchor. Gradually, Alara began to emerge from the shell of fear and humiliation. She started by helping with small tasks, shelling dried beans, or stirring the stew. Her hands, though one bore the ugly mark, remembered the rhythm of domestic life. The scent of pine and wood smoke mingled with the smell of Thomas's simple cooking, a comforting blend that spoke of home, a concept she thought she'd lost forever. She learned about Thomas, too, in snippets of conversation. He was a good man, honest and hardworking. He spoke fondly of his late wife, Martha, and with quiet pride of his grown children, a son who worked in a logging camp and a daughter married to a farmer in the next valley. He was lonely, she realized, in his own quiet way, just as she had been in Harmony Creek, though for different reasons. The harsh Montana winter raged outside, but inside the cabin, a gentle spring of healing began. Alara found a strange peace in the routine, waking to the crackle of the fire, the quiet chores, the shared, simple meals. Thomas never once brought up Harmony Creek or the accusations. He treated her simply as Alara, a woman in need of kindness, not as a witch or an outcast. This unwavering acceptance was like fresh water to a parched throat, washing away the bitter taste of judgment. Her laughter, a sound she hadn't truly made in years, began to return. At first, it was a shy, quiet chuckle at something Thomas said, then a fuller, richer sound as she found comfort in his steady company. The deep-seated humiliation that had weighed her down started to lift, replaced by a fragile sense of self-worth. She wasn't just the branded widow. She was Alara, a woman who could mend, who could cook, who could find beauty in the quiet strength of the wilderness, and who, surprisingly, was not alone. The cabin became more than a shelter. It became a sanctuary where her broken spirit could mend, piece by careful piece. As Alara's strength fully returned, so did her natural inclination to contribute, to be useful. She couldn't bear to simply be a guest, to take without giving. Her hands, though one still bore the stark reminder of her past, found purpose again. She began to take over the cooking, transforming Thomas's simple, often bland, stews into savory, comforting meals. The aroma of herbs and spices, once familiar in her own home, now filled Thomas's cabin, making it feel more alive, more welcoming. She baked bread, its crust golden and warm, a scent that drew Thomas in from his trapping rounds with a pleased smile. Thomas had mentioned his children, a son and a daughter, who lived further away. But one brisk afternoon, a sleigh pulled by a sturdy pony jingled its way through the snow to the cabin. Out tumbled two small figures, a boy of 7 with bright, curious eyes, and a girl of 5 with braids that bounced as she ran. These were Thomas's grandchildren, little Caleb and Lily, visiting their grandpa for a few days. Their mother, Thomas's daughter, waved from the sleigh, gave Thomas a quick hug, and then left them in his care. Alara felt a pang of nervousness. Children, would they be afraid of her? Would they see the brand, or hear stories from their parents about the witch from Harmony Creek? She tried to make herself small, to hide her hand, but it was too late. Lily, bolder than her brother, skipped right up to Alara, her eyes wide with innocent wonder. "Grandpa has a new friend," she declared, her voice a sweet chime. Caleb, a bit shyer, clung to Thomas's leg, but peered at Alara with open curiosity. Thomas, seeing Alara's hesitation, put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Alara, these are Caleb and Lily. And children, this is Alara. She's helping me keep the cabin warm and fed." To Alara's immense relief, the children showed no fear, only simple curiosity. They were too young to understand the dark tales of townsfolk. Soon, Alara found herself drawn into their world of games and stories. She taught Lily how to braid simple patterns with yarn and showed Caleb how to whittle a stick into a toy bird. Their innocent laughter filled the cabin, a sound Alara hadn't realized she missed so terribly. She cooked their favorite oatcakes and told them stories by the fire, her voice growing stronger and more melodic with each passing day. She helped them with their lessons, reading from Thomas's well-worn books. The children, in turn, offered her a kind of healing she hadn't anticipated. Their open hearts and trusting smiles chipped away at the last vestiges of her humiliation. In their eyes, she was simply Alara, a kind woman who told good stories and made delicious food, not a marked outcast. Caring for Caleb and Lily brought a joyful rhythm back to Alara's life. It wasn't just about chores. It was about nurturing, about being needed and appreciated. Thomas would watch her with the children, a soft, contented smile often playing on his lips. The cabin, once a lonely place for a widower, now hummed with a warmth that went beyond the roaring fire, filled with the comforting sounds of a family. The days grew longer, the snow began its slow retreat, and with it, a new warmth bloomed in Alara's heart. The constant, gnawing fear that had shadowed her every step for so long had finally receded. In Thomas's cabin, she was not just safe but valued. Her cooking brought smiles to his face, her mending made his worn clothes last longer, and her presence filled the quiet corners of his home with life. She often found herself humming soft tunes as she worked, melodies she hadn't realized she remembered. The brand on her hand was still there, a raised, faded scar, but its power over her had lessened. It was no longer a symbol of shame, but a testament to a past she had survived, a bridge to the unexpected kindness she had found. Thomas never stared at it, never mentioned it, treating her as if it simply wasn't there, or rather, as if it didn't define her. Alara and Thomas fell into a comfortable rhythm. They shared simple meals by the fire, talking about the weather, the traps, the changing seasons. Sometimes they would just sit in companionable silence, listening to the crackle of the wood and the distant calls of the wilderness. She learned of his quiet wisdom, his deep respect for nature, and his steady, unwavering kindness. He learned of her strength, her gentle spirit, and the quiet sadness that still sometimes flickered in her eyes. One evening, as the sun dipped below the snow-capped peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Alara stood by the cabin window. The vast, wild beauty of Montana, once a symbol of her despair, now felt comforting, a grand and peaceful backdrop to her new life. She turned to see Thomas watching her, a soft, unreadable expression on his face. "It's a beautiful land," she said, her voice quiet. "It is," Thomas agreed, stepping closer. "And it can be a harsh one, too. But it also holds a great deal of good, if you know where to look." He gestured around the cabin. "This place, it feels right with you here, Alara." His words, simple and heartfelt, settled deep within her. It wasn't just physical warmth she had found, or a roof over her head. It was a belonging, a sense of being seen and accepted for who she truly was, not for what others accused her of being. The loneliness that had been her constant companion since her husband's death, and that had sharpened into unbearable agony after her banishment, began to melt away. She realized, with a quiet wonder, that she felt at home, not just in the cabin, but in the quiet, steady rhythm of life with Thomas. It was a feeling she had believed was lost to her forever, buried under the snow and ashes of her old life. But here, in this remote cabin, beside this good, kind man, a new warmth had truly begun to bloom. The spring brought with it a gentle softening of the world outside, and an even deeper warmth within the cabin. Alara and Thomas had settled into a life of quiet companionship, a shared existence woven with respect and unspoken understanding. The memories of Harmony Creek still lingered like faint shadows, but they no longer held the power to consume her. Thomas's love, though never declared in grand words, was clear in his steady gaze, his thoughtful actions, and the simple comfort of his presence. One evening, As the last light of soft spring day faded, they sat by the fire. The flames danced, casting warm, shifting patterns on the log walls. Alara was mending one of Thomas's shirts, her fingers nimble, the branded hand moving with ease. Thomas watched her, a quiet tenderness in his eyes. He cleared his throat, a small sound in the peaceful room. "Alara," he began, his voice a little softer than usual. She looked up, her needle pausing. "Yes, Thomas." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, plain wooden box. Inside, nestled on a bed of soft, dried moss, lay a simple silver ring. It wasn't flashy or grand, but it gleamed softly in the firelight, its surface smooth and unadorned. Alara's breath caught. Thomas took the ring from a box, his hand trembling just a little. He gently took her left hand, the one bearing the brand. His thumb brushed lightly over the raised scar, not in judgment but in acceptance. His eyes met hers, full of a love so deep and unexpected, it brought tears to Alara's eyes. "This belonged to Martha," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It's not fancy, but it's true." He looked at the brand, then back at her, his gaze unwavering. "Alara, you have brought light back into this home. You have brought joy. I want you to stay. Always." With infinite care, Thomas slipped the simple silver band onto her finger, right next to the faded brand. The cool metal felt like a promise, a gentle embrace against the harsh memory. It was a ring placed not over the scar to hide it, but beside it, to show that even a mark of shame could exist alongside a symbol of love. Alara looked at the ring, then at Thomas, her heart swelling with a gratitude so profound it stole her words. He had seen past the brand, past the whispers, past the fear. He had seen her, Alara, and loved her. She leaned forward, resting her head against his shoulder, her branded hand now adorned with the ring, a testament to humiliation overcome, to healing found, and to an unexpected, enduring love blooming by a quiet fire in the Montana wilderness. The warmth that filled her was not just from the fire, but from the deep, quiet joy of finally, truly belonging.